Hello everyone, this is the finale of What If Naruto Owed Ino a Favor, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Maybe I could help you get him back, Ino suddenly blurted. The words escaped her so quickly that she didn't quite grasp them until it was too late. They lingered in the air, blowing with the breeze. I mean, he's always liked you. She spoke through clenched teeth. Ever since you were kids, right? She added with a hint of a smile lingering. Would you really do that for me? Sakura was wide-eyed, turning to stare at her friend. She was surprised by the sudden proposition and found herself flashing Ino a smile full of excitement. Some sort of intrigued interest quivered in her words, leaving a burning impression in Ino's midsection. It was a content and grotesque feeling all the same. Was this some sort of revenge, she thought, for Sakura? She couldn't quite explain her actions, but she understood she could not back down now. They strolled down the lively Konoha streets, leaving a trail of footprints in the melted snow behind them. She hesitated a bit, before mumbling, sure, the enthusiasm leaving her faster than it had first came. Ino, even though we fought for most of our childhood, Sakura made a grab for Ino's cold fingers, you were always my closest friend. You were too. Ino hid her wicked smile, tipping her head to the side. They continued to walk through the streets, warm fingers entwined. Of course, it was inevitable that Naruto would find her, and the occasion called for her impeccable timing. Whipping up a top-notch meal was beginning to bore him. Not to mention Sasuke was out of the house, surprisingly, and being alone was such a drag. Besides, he thought, taking a stroll was far more interesting than dwelling inside Sasuke's boring, old, don't-touch-anything apartment. He chucked the spoon back into the empty soup bowl, the metal clattering against the dishware before he sighed. Well, he murmured lowly, drumming his fingers on the broad counter in front of him, that was good. He chuckled softly, reaching into his pocket for cold crisp yen bills. Naruto waved one last goodbye to the owner as he stepped away from the ramen shop. But before he could shift his gaze to the pallid scenery of snowy Konoha, a certain flow of blonde hair left his eyes lingering and his heart pounding. He stared ahead of himself, finding it quite difficult to hold his breath. Ino, quite the oblivious one, continued to walk away, her back to him. He held his eyes on the back on her back, soaking in the image of her hair as it bounced with each step. Blonde locks in a ponytail, of course, because Ino was always lazy in the morning. He smiled down at the trail of snow, fighting the urge to hoot or holler. He couldn't quite explain the wildness in himself, but chose to correspond with impulse. First in long strides, he broke his steps into a scurry, trying his best to catch up to the quick-moving Ino in a noiseless manner. Naturally, he was too caught up in reaching her to figure out any sort of smooth talking, so when he did reach her, he allowed a faint, embarrassed blush to settle on his cheeks. Ino remained wordless, misplaced in her own thoughts of sorts to consider looking over her shoulder. She wore a black jacket and the hem of a skirt that fluttered just below her knees. He had an eyebrow, surprised at her manner of dress, but it was at this moment that he could not help himself, or his libido. I've seen you somewhere else before. He leaned in slightly close, his voice hoarse. The sudden roughness shed Ino from her closed state and she physically shook, completely taken aback. Can you help me? I'm lost. She tipped her head to the side, catching the sight of the ever-eager Naruto. She even appeared relieved for a second or two until she let out a soft sigh. You were always lost. No, I don't believe so. He scratched at his chin, peering at the sky for a moment before returning his gaze. I wasn't always lost. Oh yeah, yes. He nodded. They continued to walk a few paces ahead. As comfortable as she used to be with him, she was surprised to take note of how awkward it felt now at the moment. Naruto eyed the road ahead, which continued to be a trail of empty road. He then dropped his gaze, his fingertips reaching over to gently brush against her warm skin. You know you s the hell out of me back then. He chuckled, hoping to have cleared any bad air. A slight smile crept on her as she shook her head, locks of her hair dancing from side to side. You're so dumb, Ino said quietly, turning to meet his gaze. Another void of silence passed and Naruto began to fiddle with his hands. Mind blank, he could not configure any sort of words to form a conversation. Not to mention, as much as he tried to withdraw it, he felt the same tingle in himself, so much so that he ceased smiling. So how's Sasuke? Ino asked, unexpectedly. Grumpy, quiet, same bastard he always was. He calls me his housewife, Naruto sulked, briefly remembering the short memories of Sasuke practically beating him with a wooden spoon. How'd you figure? You're wearing his clothes, she remarked, poking at the navy blue shirt that unveiled itself under an unzipped overcoat, a glimpse of the Uchiha symbol proudly peeking underneath. Yeah, he grumbled, bearing in mind the other ways his friend had already tormented him for wearing anything that was his. I can't wait to get out of these though. He plucked at the shirt, wrinkling the collar. Well, it's better than your orange and banana. No, not really, he interjected, frowning. So, did you burn my clothes yet or what? I'd never do that. She grimaced, eyes darting to meet his gaze. Naruto stared back, unconvinced. Soon enough, a smile played upon her you have too many clothes for me to bother even blowing them up. Anyway, it's not like I didn't put them to waste. I use them mainly for wash clothes, you know. Oh yeah. His face lit up followed by a grin. That's just what I'd wanted. Using my clothes to clean kitchen stains, how nice. Ino giggled, reaching her arm out to give him a playful S on the C. But before her recoil, Naruto grasped her wrist, bare and exposed, yanking her so quickly that Ino could only yelp in surprise. You should have seen that coming, Naruto spoke in an unintentional whisper. He was met with a smile so radiant, a gentle hue of cerulean. In his days, he could not resist, and returned her beautiful smile with a light-hearted smirk of his own. After a second or two, Ino stepped back and suddenly flashed him a grin far from malicious. Naruto aired an eyebrow with a curious expression on his handsome features, but before he could ask, she spoke. I guess you should have seen that as well. She shrugged. Naruto winced, peering below his shirt to see a kunai pushed against his skin, fortunately, with not enough force to pierce through. The little maneuver that she pulled left a wide L at the hem of Sasuke's shirt. Instead of showing any shock, he exhaled sharply. I was distracted by a pretty face, he said in a tone that underlined fact, and he watched her cheeks flush. There was another moment of silence as Ino kept her gaze towards the ground, and Naruto could not find himself to look away. He scratched at his chin, hoping to find a way to speak but found himself speechless. She reached for his shirt, giving it a few tugs before letting go. You're a real goofy one. She turned away for a second before she met his gaze again. She held her mouth ajar, her words caught in her tea. You think that I love Sakura, don't you? Naruto grimaced, wishing he could just take away her teary stare. I think you're better off with her. I think you're lying. It sure doesn't seem like a lie. Ino suddenly cried out, rage deeply embedded. She held out her hand, fingers entwined with cloth. Here, take it. Well, I don't love Sakura. I wouldn't be feeling so guilty for the past month if I did. He too shouted, his words echoing before them. She shuddered at the sound of his voice, but did not hesitate to reply, what are you trying to tell me? Although the moment did not call for it, he could not help but smile. There, standing before him, was Ino. Her bright blue eyes were clouded with tears, emitting such a beautiful sadness that he could not help but admire it. He shoved his hands into his empty pockets and leaned forward. He then proceeded to brush his L against her cheek in a soft, gentle K. He pulled away. Nothing and everything. That doesn't make any sense. Perhaps, Naruto mused, nodding a bit. Slowly he turned, in profile, away from Ino. He appeared to be looking over at the otherwise empty street. From left to right not a soul stood or wandered, which was typical on a snowy day. Okay, the coast is clear, let's go. He seized her hand, swiftly but softly, giving it a small squeeze. What are you doing? Ino cried out, trying to pull away. She loosened her grip on the kunai. Her weapon of choice dropped onto the snow, vanishing under the flurries. Don't get so flustered, I'm trying to do something nice. He dragged her a couple of steps forward. Ino followed, afraid to have herself pulled over, onto the snow-covered ground. Niece, I'm supposed to be mad at you. Alright, fine. I'm sorry. Now, can I just take you out to eat? What? She asked, her voice an octave higher, but she allowed herself to be taken. Are you kidding? Blah, 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 for abroad, all you do is nag. Excuse me, Ino screamed, but her cries went unheard. They became muffled by the sounds of chimes dancing above her head. Hastily, she was pulled through the open door, a gust of heated air brushing against her cheeks, leaving her quite flushed. Her boots clacked against the wood floors as she allowed herself to be led through the narrow hallway. What awaited them both was a partially empty restaurant, where people chatted casually and others ate patiently. Ino sighed, feeling quite defeated in her effort to appear irritated. She sat herself upon an open booth, pulling at her jacket zipper. You're still hungry. You just finished eating 3 whole bowls of ramen soup. Oh, so you were stalking me. I was not, she cried out, rouge tinting underneath her eyes. It was so easy to get her riled up. Naruto chuckled to himself, taking the menu in his hands. I just hope you don't go cheap on me and order a stupid salad. Fine. Ino rolled her eyes, snatching the menu from him. She stuck her tongue out and whispered the names of the foods to herself. It was not a fancy place, this runaway restaurant, but it held substantial warmth considering the dim lamps that added a personal setting towards the place. There came an unrepentant calm, afterwards. Ino fixed her eyes upon the text, so focused her vision became blurry. It didn't settle for long, however, because suddenly she felt ridiculous. Ino, even though we fought for most of our childhood, so easily had her words into her conscious, it was quite irritating, you were always my closest friend. Probably impulse, but Ino quickly her fist, finding the table to tremble along with her touch, as if to disregard Sakura's silly remark. Certainly, that wasn't true, was it? I don't want to do this. She bit at the inside of her cheek. Aggravated and distressed all the same, over and over. Before she could heed his words, she found herself leaving as her fists clenched tightly. Her eyes narrowed and she slung her arms to her sides. She heard mumbles of protests, underneath her blaring anger, yet tossed it to the side. Who cares? She thought. She just needed to get out. Sakura suddenly became such a burden, such a disaster. Her promise was outrageous and she was crazy for thinking she could ever win. What a silly promise. Ino rushed past the mourning crowd, pushing through them before apologizing afterwards. When she crashed into her sensei, she managed to mouth an apology to Asuma, who appeared to have wanted to speak to her. Of course, she was rushing, which was never natural for her, in this light of the morning. She sprinted up a flight of stairs, trying her best to dodge the unfortunate Genma who carried masses of paperwork by Tsunade-sama's request. She simply waved, biting a chuckle when she caught sight of Genma's frustration, before continuing in her hurry. She was able to calm herself once she reached the last stair, but not enough to keep the jitters from dancing in her stomach. Finally, she thought, stopping to catch her breath. A mission, a regular B-rank mission, but still, a mission. This morning she was surprised by a letter from Tsunade, and what a wonderful surprise it was. Only one step more, she thought, and she'd finally have a mission of her own. Yet, before her fingernails ever had the chance to graze the cold handle, the door briskly swung open, revealing a partly bored Sakura, who fiddled with ample amounts of paperwork. Ino fought the nasty squirms that swirled inside and smiled. Sakura was much too occupied with reading a scroll aloud to herself to make any effort for a greeting. A little relieved, Ino allowed herself to step into the room. She grinned widely, nodding towards Tsunade who happened to be amid a conversation herself. Tsunade's eyes trailed to meet Ino as she smiled and extended her arm, motioning her to come closer. Then, as she stepped away from the door frame, her eyes caught sight of the blonde to her right. She almost sighed, but held back of course, in fear of ruining any first impressions to her Hokage. Always happens to me, this sort of bee, she thought to herself angrily, so clouded in her ranting, she could not recall Sakura, until the medical nin intentionally bumped into her. Wordlessly her friend only smiled sweetly, winking as she strolled past her and out of the room. Oh great, I forgot about my priceless advice. Miss Yamanaka. Tsunade arched an eyebrow, quite confused herself. Ino laughed nervously, quickly scurrying into her seat, so caught up in her anxiety that she practically crashed into Naruto's chair, who promptly held out his hand to grab her from falling. Ino would have protested, she wished she should had, but by the way her luck was pulling through, she felt silence was the best way to handle the situation. Instead of doing any of her latter wishes, she stood still with Naruto's arm locked around her midsection, keeping her from falling. She turned to meet Tsunade, who only stared back with complete amusement. Well, that was quite an entrance, Yamanaka. Tsunade brought her palm towards her mouth, chuckling a bit. Yeah, Ino, Naruto laughed, understanding the safe zone he was in at the time and taking advantage of it. Shut up, she mumbled into his ear, before pulling from his grasp and seating herself onto the chair beside him. Too bad Ino wouldn't let herself listen to Tsunade. She forced herself to stare at the floor and proceeded to criticize herself. Stupid, 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 I'm so stupid. Only a few flurries of words passed her by, in which she never put much thought into it. Mission 2, Ino and, accompany him, take days, be careful, Tako. Tako. Ino widened her eyes as her ears picked up the sound of an unfamiliar name. She turned towards Naruto, her face squirming. He would have been laughing too, except the look on his face held neither laughter nor content. It was a dark scowl. And before she could ask Tsunade-sama who the heck Tako was, she found her palm to be taken by the hand of not Naruto, but what appeared to be someone she'd never met before. Ino held onto her blank expression, too mixed up herself to keep from pulling away. The teenager, she guessed was Tako, only her palm gently, his auburn bangs covering a portion of his face. What the? She blushed quickly, her teeth clenching. Okay. Naruto exasperated, pushing his hand against Ino's, breaking the contact between she and the stranger. His angry cry echoed against the stone walls, leaving Ino a bit surprised herself. The one named Tako laughed quietly as he nodded in Ino's direction. Ino found herself gaping at the fellow in front of her. So Ino, are you up for it? Tsunade's voice interrupted her brief staring contest. She tensed as she finally faced Tsunade, who was always intolerant of ignorance. Sure, she laughed, waving her hand nervously. What exactly was this mission again? Tsunade narrowed her eyes and Ino sunk a few inches into her chair, recognizing that motherly glare. Naruto took one look at the cluster of clouds staring right back at him, and dared the colorless fluffs to incite him. He narrowed his eyes, a bit blinded by the pallid hues of white. Cloudy, he thought, a whole bunch of clouds and not enough sun. His curious eyes wandered towards the trail of woods ahead of him, at the endless miles of vegetation. Too many damn trees, he muttered, shifting his gaze back towards the sky. Yet, his moment of random observations were interrupted, when the whisper of a low murmur tickled his ear. Pretty nice outside, isn't it? Tako finally spoke. Naruto practically felt himself tremble at the sudden tone of voice, at the slightly playful manner in which he said it. Instead of a noisy reaction, as Naruto was so notorious for, he allowed the resonance of wildlife to return. He turned to meet a pair of blazing auburn eyes, with a matching radiant smile. He arched an eyebrow, attempting to look as clueless as he could. As much as he tried, Tako appeared unconvinced as the smile ceased to have left him. In fact, he looked a bit more excited than before. What? I just didn't want to get off to a wrong start, you know. Tako nodded, his bangs bouncing along with his enthusiasm. There was another moment of silence, which Naruto found somewhere between eerie and awkward. He couldn't help but notice that the oblivious Ino was walking in front of the pair, preoccupied with who knows what. I didn't think about it until now, but my actions were quite ridiculous. Tako laughed with a wave of his hand as if to brush off his own worries. When he finally did turn back towards Naruto, he was only given a blank stare, to which he was somewhat accustomed to with this blonde teenager, since the moment they have met, which wasn't very long ago. I mean, it was rude, I didn't mean to make any assumptions upon your girlfriend. He pointed in front, with his index finger. A sort of grin plastered his features, as if he were trying to tease him. For a second, Tako held his breath, allowing for any tensions to ease off. He was a bit of a mischievous fellow, but was always a bit weary of crossing the line, which he was a bit infamous for, in fact. He watched as the slight flush settled into Naruto's cheeks, all wide-eyed and astonished. She isn't. Naruto quickly stammered, grinding his teeth as an afterthought to his embarrassment. Above all else, he couldn't control that impulse, which was beginning to be quite annoying. I don't know, you seem to have pretty strong feelings for her. A bit surprised himself, Tako glanced up to check if Ino overheard him at all, to which as far as he could tell, she did not. I don't. Not at all. We're just friends. Naruto tried his best to force a fake, choppy, chuckle anything to convince this guy. Whatever it was, perhaps it was his nerves, but at that moment in time, his pride seemed to have overcome him and he wanted to keep that intact. I think that she knows, Tako snorted, amused by his attempts to remain sober. Knows what? The boy only shook his head, his grin widening. I don't have to tell you the story of the birds and the bees, do I? I thought you were much smarter than that. Naruto could only smile in return. A bit witty himself, one could only nod off at another's clever remarks. All right then. Tako laughed, his newfound friend on his back. The gesture seemed to have loosened the tension between them as Naruto let out his own laugh. Even though he had never met the guy before, he was already starting to like him. Oddly enough. Yet another instant of silence passed between them, but this time less discomforted. Naruto hesitated a second, awaiting to ask Tako of his past before the boy spoke up for him, and stated ever so friendly. So then, it's a challenge. He smirked, bringing up his fist into a thumbs-up gesture. A bit confused, once more, Naruto asked, what's a challenge? With which Tako then replied, what do you think? And winked before he quickly jogged in front of Naruto, a few paces ahead of him as he made his way towards Ino. Naruto could only pause, allowing his fingers to brush against his small blonde hairs. He smiled, admitting defeat for this small round, though he would not have confessed it at first. He guessed Tako sharper than he cared to give him credit for. Finally, he exhaled briefly, partly amused by the idea of someone besides he attempting to woo Ino, only because it was such a hard if not bold task to accomplish. Good luck. He chuckled a bit, kicking at the dirt below him. He watched as the broken pieces of dust and stone scrambled into the air, fogging his view momentarily. If only for a moment, when the small particles of dust wavered on, he caught a glimpse of Ino glancing back at him before she quickly turned away. There was something in the way she looked at him, but he could not tell exactly what. He held his breath, hoping to have kept himself from smiling. Yet, before he could acknowledge it, he felt the ends of his L tucking in a half-hearted grin. As much as he enjoyed viewing the scenery, as green-toned as it was, he was beginning to get bored. Being accustomed to so many A-rank missions himself, escorting this fellow was like walking a child down the block, quite uneventful. Not to mention, in this ordinary trip of his, it only meant extended agonizing hours. He endured it as much as he could, keeping to himself and towards his imagination, where his eyes lingered between the animal shapes in the sky or taking a small glance at the pair in front of him, not that he was worried, of course. It wasn't until his stomach began to cry for help when he couldn't stand the silence any longer. Hungry, he spoke weakly, rubbing at his abdomen. The pair in front of him continued to speak mindless gibberish which he didn't want to try and comprehend. When he figured that his feeble statement went unnoticed, he grew a bit irritated, this time speaking a tone much louder than before. I'm starving. Naruto complained, biting onto his lower lip as he felt his nerves begin to tense. Ugh, we're not even halfway yet, Naruto. Can't you wait? Ino frowned, turning to send him an angry glare. He ignored her, doubling over as if he were in pain. Oh great leader, I cannot wait any longer, he emmed dramatically, for my stomach is about to implode on itself. It is getting quite late, Tako mumbled, lifting his head towards the sky. The sky has turned pink. Perhaps we should stay here. Yeah, exactly. Ino, don't be so heartless. Ino shook her head, pulling the backpack off of her shoulders, setting it down on the ground. Naruto, I don't think you get it, but I'm trying to make a good impression on my first mission in a long, long time. Ino had hoped to leave Naruto feeling a bit guilty, but when she looked at him for any sort of reply he responded with the usual smile of his yet with an unusual response. Thank you, he nodded, pulling off his own backpack. She quickly turned her back on both Naruto and that other guy whose name she already forgot. Kneeling down to grab at her unopened cans of food she growled and began to mumble to himself, I don't get where he's going with this cutesy, polite, Mr. Nice guy act. It's not working. A cool breeze settled into the once heat-ridden woods, the slightly pinkish hues of the skies now enveloped by the blanket of twilight, hovering over the three as they ate. The meal would have been eaten in silence if not for Tako's odd approach for telling him of some sort of terrifying urban legend as he ate. So, Night had fallen and I was in this shed, I mean my house when I heard a sound, I mean noise. Naruto could only lean back against the log that he sat upon, taken aback by how sociable this guy was. While he had a mouthful of rice, he blinked, his attention stolen away from his precious ramen, towards Tako who only spoke and spoke and spoke. He shifted his gaze to Ino, who also held her mouth ajar and, if even for that slight second, they shared an agreement for the first time that night, Tako was not very good at storytelling. When he finally finished his complicated urban legend turned horror story, Tako had run out of things to say and quickly patting his stomach as he placed his half-eaten plate to the side. That was really good, he mused, pushing himself off the log. Tako lifted his arms, taking a stretch as he shut his eyes tight. Wow, I didn't expect myself to tire so quickly. He snorted, leaning towards the right so as to pull any and all sorts of tension from his muscles. He turned towards Ino, waving his hand. Good night, Miss Yamanaka, he said, watching as she continued to assemble the mesh of cloth and metal scraps in which she called a tent. Good night, Naruto, Tako murmured as he walked off towards his own area of privacy. Unlike Ino, the boys had decided to sleep in their sleeping bags. Naruto nodded, before he turned to his own and practically shouted, "Night guys," and flopped onto his lumpy, old sleeping bag, forgetting that it wasn't a mattress. He emmed from the pain in his jaw after it onto the ground. Ouch. Ino turned back, a bit surprised with his departure. She glanced down at her hands that gripped against the hard tent materials. It was then that she remembered she could not assemble anything for the life of her. Sighing heavily as she slumped against the bundle in her arms, she finally admitted defeat. She figured, even if there was nothing left he could have at least offered a hand. Naruto knew very well she sucked at putting things together from scratch. Feeling a bit dismayed from her lonely state, she turned behind her, hoping to have seen any sign of existence at least if he was around, she could have pestered him into building the crazy contraption. Yet, what greeted her were outlines of trees and a void of darkness. Only from the freckles of illumination above her could he depict the smoky ashes of their recent campfire and a slumped figure of a sleeping Tako from afar. Damn, she mumbled, turning back to her mess at hand. You really think I would leave you like that? Hastily, she turned to find Naruto, down on one knee so as to catch her at eye level. She yelped, pushing herself backwards as her arm fell behind her for support. Her palm grinded against ragged pebbles as clumps of dirt settled under her fingernails. Her eyes widened to an extent where Naruto himself could depict the shape of the moon in her pale azure orbs. Laughter filled her abyss of fear as she swiftly rubbed her cheeks, cursing herself for ever demonstrating her vulnerability so easily. Are you blushing, Ino? He asked, his voice low and rough. There was a smile in his words. What are you doing awake? Ino growled, baring her teeth in her irritated manner. We have plenty to do tomorrow. Exactly, so when are you going to sleep, Ino? When I get this damn tent up. Ino, Naruto rolled his eyes, plopping himself onto the dirt ground. He crossed his arms, shaking his head. Why'd you bring so much junk? All you need is a sleeping bag. Are you going to help me, or are you going to bother me? Irritated, Ino scrunched her mouth to the side. Oh sure, I can help you, he stated, rather happily. He reached his hand into her pile of mesh, pulling out a latent puffy sleeping bag. He shoved the sleeping bag into the air, dropping it in front of him. Once spread, he patted the sides, unfastening the zipper before patting the far ends of her knapsack. Done. That's not what I need help in, you idiot, I need you to put the tent up. You don't need the tent, Ino, you need to look at the stars when you're outdoors, Naruto stated matter-of-factly, turning back to send a smirk in her direction. Ino sighed, dumping the junk in her arms behind her. I guess you're right, she agreed, crawling a few inches ahead, allowing her legs to slip into the parted folds of the knapsack. The crinkles and shuffling of her legs see off any opportunity of silence. Once the echoes of her sleeping bag ceased, Naruto felt himself grow uneasy. The sudden peace that settled into the air was a bit troubling, and for the first time his mind went blank on any sort of approach of conversation. It was times like these where he felt his much-practiced charm dwindle and his sophisticated teasing depart swiftly, so as to leave him uncertain of his own allure. He bit his lip, taking in a gulp of cool night air as he searched for something to say. Instead, he could only turn towards Ino, moving his mouth as to say something remotely intriguing, yet nothing but a few puffs of air left him. He could not help but feel captivated in the way she held her blank expression. His attempts at speaking left him, he continued to allow himself to be drawn by the radiant cerulean hue of her eyes. Ino bowed her head, so as to break the magnetism that was pulling at her so. Her bangs covered a portion of her eyes as she proceeded to stare at her soil-stained palms. Naruto, sensing her discomfort, felt that this was the time to leave. He fought against the urge to touch her jaw, deciding instead to lift himself off the ground. But as he arose from his feet, Ino seized a hold of his pant leg, quickly tugging it so as to leave him falling over. He yelped, completely shocked by the move, tripping over her bent legs, falling forward. His midsection fell onto the knapsack, but the rest of him wasn't so lucky. After a grunt or so, he paused for a moment before whispering a weak, ouch. Are you okay, Naruto? I'm sorry. He pushed himself off the ground, spitting out the broken pieces of wood that were jammed into his mouth. Before he could stand up, or give any sort of reassurance, Ino grasped his arm, pulling him as close to him as she could with one tug. I'm sorry, she apologized, her hands grazing against his cheek, brushing away the small pieces of dirt and pebbles. No, it's okay. He spoke over her apologetic gibberish, smiling at her worried tone of voice. I'm all right. I was stupid. I should have thought before I did that. I always do stuff like that. I didn't mean to do that. Naruto grabbed a hold of her jittering hands, giving him a little squeeze. Ino, it's okay. I'm alive. He chuckled, the small joke passing her by. I know. A small blush settled onto her cheeks. In the preceding silence, Ino found her eyes wander onto her hands, still linked and laced with Naruto's. For once, she did not protest, instead deciding to allow the atmosphere to settle into tweets and twitters of the night animals. Somewhere in her conscious, where her darkest notions lie, stood a voice. I just wonder. Naruto inhaled deeply, hoping to have read the thoughts in her eyes. The bright hues in her eyes suddenly turned dull and dry. She sat onto the chilly ground, her expression full of misery. He then bit his lip, curious for words when he was at a loss. Oddly enough, her once warm hands were becoming a bit cold in his grasp. The noises of their environment echoed into his ear, deafening him if only for a moment. You probably don't care what I have to say. As much as she tried to avoid it, it yelled and shouted in its harsh whispers. The voice left a guilty etching as well as a sour feeling in her gut. She grimaced, knowing that if she did not comply, she would only be the one to blame. The voice grew an octave louder. He searched eagerly for that spark, for the smile in her eyes, for any sign of laughter and euphoria. Instead, what he received was awkward silence and a woman who appeared so desperate in her stance that he could not help but break that contact with their hands, bringing her chilly form close to his own cold body. At the very least, she complied, however silently, as her arms went limp and fell at their sides. Ino, I know I'm no good at these things, but that doesn't mean you have to go lifeless on me, he whispered, hearing her half-hearted laughter somewhat left him a bit relieved. I hate this thing, it's so damn bright. If that guy were dangerous in this mission, anyone could have caught you in this bright get-up, ya know. She said, pushing him away. Her voice was a bit muffled, her mouth partly covered by his oversized infamous orange jacket. She watched him smile pleasantly as he bowed his head. He snorted, amused by her comment. And then, something slightly amazing happened. The voice that pressured against her temples, its impressions that once strained, passed. Ino felt herself relax, her muscles unwind and her shoulders loosen up. It was impulsive, a dangerously liberating aura that lifted and both shifted her. She blinked, hesitating for a moment before she let out a giggle. Her laughter echoed against the peaceful, inactive atmosphere. Naruto stared at her, a bit stunned by her spontaneous behavior. She glared right back, watching that dopey, confused expression plague him. Instead of criticizing him, on his disorderly appearance in this dark night, she allowed her giddiness to follow. A fluttery sensation left her smiling rather goofy herself, and for this once, she did not shy away. Hey, she grabbed onto the collar of his jacket, scrunching the material deep into her fist. She yanked him closer, ignoring his sudden yelps. I care about you more than you think. He arched an eyebrow, defensive in his own manner. Is that so? He sounded unconvinced, his sarcasm filtering the air, yet his flushed expression said otherwise. The warmth of her breath softly touched his and Ino could only compel herself to continue staring. His response left her aggravated though, and her anger unexpectedly rose. However, instead of screaming, which she felt the immediate desire to, she pushed her fury aside and decided to demonstrate her feelings. She yanked once more on his collar, possibly the worst thing to do at the moment, but she allowed her free hand to hold onto the back of his head as she forced him into a heavy K. Their melded together in an abrupt fashion. Quick and sudden, she poured out those once spiteful feelings into him, hoping that he would only catch on before her senses came to her. Naruto instinctively reached for her jaw, his thumb and index finger held at both sides as he too quickly involved himself. He was a bit taken aback by Ino's insistence to lead for the moment as she pushed his hand away. He felt himself being pushed forward as he had to bury the palm of hand into the soggy dirt. What the? Ino shoved him away, taking a deep gasp for air, a blush etched onto her cheeks as she grit her teeth at him. She rose to her feet, reaching over to her sleeping bag, her hand probing for some sort of object. Naruto skimmed his teeth over his swollen bottom lip, tasting a drop of B. I'm going to bed, good night. She appeared to have given up on her search, shrugging it off as she walked away from the knapsack. She passed him, stepping rather slowly to the other side, where his own empty sleeping bag lay. He blinked, thumbing his lip, and then smearing his own B on that digit. Wait, he whispered, to no one but himself. Wait, Ino. He mouth-squirmed, questioning that lively, fizzy sense that churned where he once thought he was starving. Realizing that Ino hadn't heard him, Naruto hung his head, sighing heavily. The words he so desperately wanted to say had now left him completely. Naruto grumbled, feeling himself wriggle into that soft, clean sleeping bag. Before he too could glare back at the starry sky, to possibly reflect on the lunacy that just happened, he felt the daunting sensation of sleep knock a powerful blow to his conscience. He sighed, feeling a sharp, jagged object jab at his leg. His arm reached for the item, feeling irritated by the anonymous jabbing and poking. Thinking it was some sort of scroll, he mindlessly threw it behind him, settling himself into the pillow. Yet, as much as he wanted to enjoy any sign of sleep, that quickly vanished with the resonance of a deep thud. He rolled himself in the bag, propping himself on his elbows. What is that? He asked himself, watching the open book on the ground with honest interest. It was apparently opened on its half, where a golden ribbon separated the pages in the middle. He edged an eyebrow, stretching his arm as his fingers stroked the soft pages. Not before long, he lifted the book from the ground, brushing the dirt clumps from its edges. Don't tell me, this is... Suddenly, his eyes twinkled with conniving curiosity as he could not help but skim through the words, the slightly slanted and curved letters that decorated the pallid paper. Shikamaru is a lazy idiot, I swear. He wouldn't get up this morning and I had to scare him in order to get his lazier off the bed. Naruto rolled his eyes, he couldn't help but agree with Ino on that notion. He knew Shikamaru was helping her with her training and that thought hasn't surprised him at all. Missions with Shikamaru were always one-sided, the only thing that guy was good for was his ingenious plans. What came next was a laundry list of unintelligible activities. Is this even a diary? Naruto scratched his head. There were plenty of recollections, of crap. Nothing good, nothing scandalous, nothing that left him filled with satisfaction. He sighed, prepared to hurl the useless journal over at Ino. I need to remember about this ridiculous mission in a few days. I don't really know what it is, but hey, at least I got an offer, right? The next wasn't even partially interesting. I had to bandage a bruise this morning. Customers were bugging me all day about flowers. Dinner was pretty bland for my second attempt, hey. What a boring day. He sucked his teeth, completely disappointed by her lack of creativity. Ino, I swear your life isn't this dull, you suck as a writer, he commented, and prepared to shut the book and call it a night. Yet, as he grabbed the front hardcover of the book, pushing the ends together, a single word left him speechless. Secret. It was small, almost illegible letters by his thumb that left him intrigued. He split the book open once more, his thumbs pressing against the pages from his rush of excitement. I know I usually choose not to write such things on pieces of paper. But I need therapy. I've heard writing down your setbacks can help, right? I don't know, really. My secret isn't anything to be excited about. I wish I had something more interesting or, at least much more pleasant to write. I hate this. I'm a liar and I know it. There was an empty page that followed. And for that moment, he felt remorseful for reading those lines. As he turned to the next page, he was welcomed with a filled sheet of scribbles. He couldn't bring himself to look away from the book, as the words practically taunted him. Sakura and I, unfortunately, as much as those words enticed him, the rest of that lingering thought was left unfinished as what followed were the shredded leftovers of a torn page. He continued to read attentively. I promised it because I didn't know what else to do. Besides, he doesn't care anymore, right? Sakura and Naruto were meant to be. I was just a pawn. There, in front of him lay a recollection of something he played a part of without much acknowledgement. A swear, written in those cursive words. He sighed, feeling a pang of fault twinge in the midst of his abdomen. He had to skim through that word a few times, as difficult as it was. Pawn left him wide awake and wondering. Hey, Tako whispered down at the sleeping face below him. It was his third attempt at awaking the Konoha nin and he had about enough. Although he was always taught on being civil, there was always an exception for these kinds of situations. Che Naruto, get up, he cried out, feeling his irritation swell. He grabbed at Naruto's cheek, tugging at it for good measure. Listen, you loaf of weight, get up. Still, that was not sufficient enough to arouse the teenager. The boy tapped at his chin, quickly running out of ideas. He just could not understand how the latter couldn't hear his round of bellows. Tako guessed he was probably tone deaf. And at that thought, he chuckled to himself, amused by his own joke. Still, he had grown to like this fellow. I could have been by now and I have these two to thank, he remarked with a snort. He observed the look of peace on Naruto's face, a bit taken aback by how calm he had appeared. With that in mind, he grinned as he reached for the dirt floor. A malicious wish came to mind and he intended to fulfill it. His palm clamped as the mass of pebbles as his grin grew wider. What an idea, he thought as he lifted his hand, prepared to throw a few pebbles at Naruto's face. Before he could have reached the blonde boy's face, an arm quickly grasped Tako's wrist as he emptied his hand, leaving Tako a bit surprised himself. Nice try, Naruto groaned, lifting his eyes. Tako quickly replaced his shocked face with a smile. Well, good morning there, sunshine. Tako greeted him, making sure to dazzle him with a cheesy smile. What the heck are you doing here? I ask myself that question too, sometimes. Naruto lifted himself in a sitting position. His first instinct was to drastically wipe at his L. What did you try to kill me? You're crazy. Right. He rolled his eyes, running his hands through his brown hair. Waking you up was a hard task to do. What are you talking about? I was awake the whole time. Really, I find that hard to believe. Tako scoffed, before replying, what an act. You sound like a cat when you're asleep or when you're pretending. So what did you really wake me up for? Verbal abuse. I get enough of it from her. Naruto nudged his head to the side, towards the direction of the sleeping Ino. Tako laughed, jabbing his index finger onto Naruto's "See, you're funny." He smiled. After waiting a few silent seconds, he then added, you two make quite the couple. Is that a compliment? Yes. Tako snorted, shaking his head side to side. He then s Naruto's back, watching as the young man yelped in sudden pain. This is goodbye, my friend. What the hell are you talking about? I don't know quite how else to put it. Tako shrugged. But well, I know my way back to my village from here. It was nice having company, though. What do you think? You're leaving. You can't. Why not? I paid for the escorts. I can fire you guys if I want to. Although his words were a bit condescending, that euphoric smile continued to radiate a sort of ecstatic optimism. Naruto could not quite put his finger on it, so he guessed that the teenager just plain weird. Weird, he thought that had to be it. Are you serious? Very. Tako nodded, offering his hand to Naruto, only to have the latter stare at it. I don't get it. Let me tell you something, Naruto. I'm not as dim-witted as I look, and as far as my foolishness goes, most of that was an act. In any case, I decided to see this little bet off short. Mostly, I miss home. Before he could have asked, Naruto remembered that semi-challenge he had the night before. Not to mention, Ino is a bit crazy herself. You two belong together. I mean that, I can see it. She's a bit impulsive, but I recognize fondness when I see it. What do you mean? Naruto, when are you going to tell her that you love her? Naruto simply gulped. He felt aculated saliva ride painfully down his tea. That was enough of a response to satisfy Tako. Instead of facing silence, Tako only grabbed the young man's hand for a good shake before he stood up. Farewell. Look me up if you ever come to the land of the rice fields. Finally, Tako turned his back towards Naruto, waving his hand as he walked into the opening path of woods ahead of him. Naruto would have thought to have stopped him, but he guessed it probably was not the right thing to do. His gut told him otherwise. Besides, Tako has just left him the perfect opportunity. He would only let him down by messing it up. As he watched the strange teenager fade away into the mass of green ahead, Naruto simply smiled, silently thanking him. Tako was probably the only push left, but in what direction he did not quite know. Ino felt the rays of sunlight pinch her face, shoving her away from her vacant dreams and into a chilly awakening. Soft winds breathed down her causing her to nudge away from the cool air. This was not a very relaxing way to get up in the morning, but Ino was unfortunate to break from her forgetful dream, feeling the sudden draft of cold morning air rush past her. She groaned rather loudly, wincing from the light that pierces her eyes. It's so early, her voice cracked from lack of moisture. Instead of taking the waking period in stride, she felt the best way to cope was to break through it. Answer, Ino pushed past that sleepy enigma that wanted ever so to settle within her. She yawned, pushing herself into a standing position. Her torso shivered, wanting to feel the blanket's warmth, or remains of warmth. She shielded her eyes from the blinding sun, turning to take a fleeting glance towards her left, at the grounds of fallen twigs and leaves. Ino expected what should have been the quite obvious sleeping Tako also settled in his own sleeping accord, yet what welcomed her was an empty mass of flat grass. What? She whispered fiercely, feeling the sudden pang of fear squirm within her insides. Before she could even turn to scream, her reaction was interrupted by the sight of Naruto kneeling beside her. The hell? She cried out, equally angry as she was frightened. She shoved his arm away, propelling herself backwards as she slid a few feet from him. What is wrong with you? She wiped at her eyes, baring her teeth at him. Can't I just say good morning? He grinned, shaking his head. An amused expression played upon his features as he offered his hand to the girl in front of him. No, she brushed herself off, pulling herself forward as she stood up. She flicked at the portions of dirt and twigs that clung to her legs. You're too sneaky for your own good, she mumbled under her breath. Yeah, Naruto lamented sarcastically, heaving an exaggerated sigh. It was not long before realization sunk in deep. Naruto. She cried out, those feelings of panic returning quicker than they had once left. That guy, where is he? He left. Naruto shrugged as he stood up. I actually saw him leave. He chuckled, pivoting his body in other direction. There, I think. It was a while ago. Gee, he was pretty nice if I say so myself. Ino could only blink for a few moments in her frightened silence. Her fear settled in a hasty matter, only to allow room for her untamed anger. I can't believe, she shook her head, dumbfounded for words. You just let him go. Why didn't you wake me up? He wanted to go by himself, what the heck was I supposed to do? You could have not let him go by himself. The whole point was for both of us to take him back to his village. Nah, he's old enough to roam on his own. Naruto laughed once more. Simon, that only makes our job easier. Now it's just you and me, back to Konoha. He held his palm behind his disarray of blonde locks, a look of sweet innocence practically plastered on his face. There was some sort of silence between them for a moment as Naruto could only help but grin. He watched as Ino balled her palms into fists. She shut her eyes as she attempted to calm herself down. Anything wrong there, Ino? Everything, she shot back. This is exactly what I mean. What? He asked, a bit confused by her response. I can't do this anymore, Naruto. In Konoha I'm only going to get scolded by Suinda-sama for not going with him. What if he gets K? Obviously there were people who wanted to hurt him, or else why would he waste his time and money on being escorted? She growled, throwing her hands up in the air. I can't believe you, I try so damn hard, ya no, Even going as far as taking this ridiculous mission because I want to be taken seriously. I'm still a chunin here, Naruto. Just because you and everyone else were able to be junins before you guys even aged into goddamn adults doesn't mean you can just do things like this. She kicked at the pebbles of rocks, muttering a few curses here and there as she continued with her rant. What the hell was the whole point of wasting all my time getting my kicked by freaking Shikamaru? She sighed, suddenly forcing herself to fall on her rear end. Small recollections of training with Shikamaru had passed her. That look of iconic laziness that Shika sports then plagued her mind entirely. This time, her voice lowered into a mere whisper. I just wanted to show Sakura, everyone, that I was still in the fight. She frowned, pausing for a round of self-remorse. Ino, quit beating on yourself like that. That's easy for you to say. You'll have 1,000 missions waiting back home for you. Naruto, you don't get it. This was a mission for them to keep me quiet. I've been pining for one for months. I'd always bother Tsunade about it, and as far as she's concerned, she thinks this is as much as I'm capable of. Ino wrung her hands together, the palms of her hands reddening from the pressure. Yeah right, Ino. Naruto inhaled deeply. He sat onto the soggy dirt filled with morning dew. Seating himself next to her, he scratched at his scalp for a second before he responded, I practically begged Tsunade to give you this mission. The comment made her cringe. Yeah. Because she probably wanted to give me some low-class kiddie task, am I right? Naruto attempted to explain himself but was interrupted. Geez, you didn't have to help my sorry eh? I suck, I know, she laughed, patting his arm. What did you say to her? Give Ino something more than finding that kooky cat. She wanted to give you an A rank, Ino. Ino let her mouth hang for a second, taking a moment to grasp that last sentence. The idea of getting an A rank was incomprehensible, so she chose instead to abide with her initial thoughts. Oh, so I got stuck with this because there was no room for me in A rank territory. Ino, she wanted to put you in an A rank mission with Shikamaru. That's the truth, you were supposed to surveillance some village we didn't have much of an alliance with. It was supposed to be different, something I know you are capable of. What the hell are you talking about? She narrowed her eyes. Tsunade thought it was the perfect team, Shikamaru, Chuji and you. Like old times. How the hell do you know? Don't ask me how I know. Another huff of warm air left him, a puff of condensation filtering the clear atmosphere. I told her not to do it, I was supposed to accompany some new chunin into this stupid mission but I suggested you. You're telling me, Ino lifted herself once more, I could have been somewhere else, basking in at least some sort of satisfaction for having to be involved in something slightly important, instead of being here. I could have been doing what was it that you said? Surveillance, I could have been doing an A rank. Instead of speaking, Naruto nodded, flinching at the thought of the many punches he was about to receive. What came next was no act of violence, instead Ino leaned to the side to pick up her belongings sprawled on the floor. I'm going home, she simply stated, her words empty and vacant. Her reaction was unnerving. Easily went the painful squirms, the hot dreadful lines and laces that filled his sea. Guilt left him faintly panting for the cool air, anything to endure the hot coals in the midst of his abdomen. Suddenly the bitter temperature that left his body shaking for warm was not enough to calm him down. What an impressive gift, Ino cried out, unable to contain the developing rage that left her be torrid. Should I thank you now, or later? She stuffed the remains of what she thought was a tent into a bag, only to find that her careless manner was making it quite difficult for her to pack her things. Impulsively, she yanked the materials out of her backpack, hurling it to the opposite direction. This doesn't matter, I don't give a s about being in the good ol' outdoors. The damn squirrels can house in that damn thing for all I care. Anger was simply too consuming as the thoughtless Ino tossed her backpack aside along with her camping material. I'm so done. I just want to go home. She stomped on her bag, assuring that the dirt smeared into the cloth material. Yet, her actions were only slightly satisfying. Aite, she sucked at her teeth, searching endlessly for words that escaped her grasp. Don't you dare follow me, was her last remark as she headed towards the direction that she believed was the path back to Konoha. Naruto watched Ino disappear between the horde of vegetation that surrounded them. Too bad she took the wrong way, he rolled his eyes. There was only one option for Naruto, he believed. He reached into his knapsack, bringing that small book close, shoving it in one of his pockets. If it were not for his favorite foolishly baggy pants, he wouldn't have known where to put her diary. With that, he followed Ino's tracks, leaving the rest of his belongings behind. He shaded his eyes, looking ahead as far as his eyes could go. He guessed by then, considering how effective her anger was, Ino was probably already a mile ahead. It didn't matter anyway, he figured he could track her quite easily. Because there was one thing about Ino and her absolute rage, it was quite obvious. While he contemplated that, he laughed, letting the tension out into the air. The hum of bird chirpings proceeded to deafen his moment of silence. His hand ruffled through his hair as he tried to think of a plan. What am I supposed to do? He finally asked, peering ahead, at the boundless trail of woods. No one answered him, of course, and well, probably that was the response he was looking for. He felt the subtle current of air tickle his cheek as it swept past him. It was faint feeling, and if not for his deep concentration, he would not have felt it at all. And to such amazement, it calmed him, that sense of cool air brushing his face. Maybe that was the answer, he thought, and with that in mind he took his first step towards the trail Ino had once taken. Naruto squinted, glaring at the sky above him. Instead of the feathery puffs of marshmallow-like clouds that awaited him the night before, there lay clouds that appeared to be less than welcoming. The once fairly pleasant November weather was now concealed by the blanket of grey skies above. Before he could quite tell, pitter-patters of raindrops plopped on his palm. Rain, he murmured, bringing his arm closer for further inspection. Wait, he felt the small hairs in the back of his spine stand erect. Oh, shush, he was left interrupted as an unexpected bellow of thunder erupted above him. Naruto ducked, raising his shoulders as the raindrops began pouring on him. The cool water soaked into his clothes, quicker than he could have suspected. In only a matter of minutes while he wandered through the woods, his clothes clung tightly to his torso and limbs, and this only makes things harder. Yet, as agitated as he once had felt, the rain was a bit relieving. Even if the dark clouds covered most of the area's visibility, the rain soaked that stress away. Naruto wiped the rain out of his eyes, peeking through the cracks of his fingers as he thought of what to do next. The right thing to do, he thought, was to find Ino, no matter how pissed she actually was. He took one last sigh before he started heading deeper into the trails. Ino pressed the left side of her body against the rough edges of the tree trunk. It was not very snug, but she needed a resting point, a break. Walking aimlessly around who knows where was not exciting in the least, especially when one was hot-headed with anger. Ino glared at what seemed like endless green to her before she allowed her wobbly knees to cave in. Her legs crashed onto the soggy ground, her clothes were soaking in the puddle of raindrops. Lost was probably not the word to describe what she was, or at least not her word of preference. Her muddled thinking had left her forgetting whether she was going backwards or forwards. Not that she was admitting it, however. Instead, she allowed the odd rhythms of the raindrops' pitter-patters to ease her hot-tempered mood. You can come out from hiding now, I'm not going to do anything. Ino shrugged, speaking rather loudly. Her posture remained as she continued to stare indifferently at the area ahead of her. Naruto, from behind, only snorted as a humid smile now plagued him. He chuckled, ducking as he walked under the tree. Not that it was any form of protection, he was already doused in rainwater. Ironically enough, the tree did offer a slight form of protection from the rain, but it was belated. Once he was alongside Ino, he plopped himself onto the ground, taking his time to breathe in the fresh time and enjoyed it. Ain't it funny? Naruto leaned backwards, placing his palm behind him. Right at this very moment, you and I are stuck here in this freezing rain, all because you dropped a bunch of fruits in front of your house. He too did not realize the implication of his statement until his words remained lingering in thin air. It was not until he let his words momentarily hang before he found it profoundly hilarious. And he laughed. His bellows of sweet laughter echoed against the trees, scaring away a few birds that had once inhabited the branches above them. Ino turned, simply to stare at him. Her look was quite blank until she too let out a small giggle. She quickly paused, attempting to catch her nervous laughter as she covered her mouth. Yet, another burst of laughter exploded from her, this time as boisterous and as happy as ever. And we're stuck here because of you, he added, now feeling himself at ease. He kicked out his feet, hooking them under his knees Indian style. Despite the fact that his clothes were either drenched with rainwater or had grime engraved into the chaise of his pant legs, he felt far more pleased with himself than he had this entire trip. Ino arched an eyebrow. Me. How so? Didn't you admit that this was your great idea? She sounded much more amused than Naruto had expected. He leaned forward, a smug grin forming on his L as he thought of a reasonable explanation. You let me stay. It was a favor, she blurted out. Realizing the severity behind her words, quickly she added, you helped me out, how could I not help you in return? You're right. Naruto took hold of hands, bringing them close as he lowered his her palms. His voice lowered down into a whisper. And, sweetheart, you don't owe me any more. As quickly as he had a hold of her hands, he had loosened his grip, as her hands slipped from his fingers. When we get out of here I'll leave you alone, for good, I promise. Ino widened her stare, glaring at him. There was a serene sadness in the alluring cerulean orbs that was left blinking in her direction before dropping its gaze. Ino bit her lip, a pang of something dreadful seeping inside her, but she did not know quite where. It was painful hearing that potential agreement, that she would never see him again, that it would never be like this, whatever this was. No, don't do that. She spoke lower than she had expected to. It troubled her to hear just how upset she sounded. This was probably it, she thought. She could not explain what it was, but she just. You left this in your bag last night. Naruto shoved his hand into his pocket, fishing for the journal. He pulled the hard-covered book out, reaching it over before Ino wordlessly grabbed onto it. Don't be mad, but I read it. Ino waited for her anger to spike, merely to find herself feeling the same. She shrugged, flipping through the pages in a vague manner before tossing the book over her shoulder. From behind, raindrops against the once dry pages, leaving the inked words to smear into a tiny blob of black ink. I'm guessing you're curious at what that page said, right? She glanced at him, a small smile spreading across her L. He stretched his arms, folding them as he held them behind the base of his N. Of course. Remember that day with you and Sakura? Ino. No, she reached over to pat his shoulder, her smile broadening. It's all right, just hear me out, okay? She watched him sigh in defeat, followed by a nod of agreement. That was probably both of our faults. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. Maybe as a way to just make sure I don't have to see you again, I promised Sakura I'd help her get you two together. What? She took another pause, biting onto her lip in a nervous manner. I don't know, I was mad with both of you. Boy, what a punishment. Naruto rolled his eyes. She really does like you, Naruto. No, he shook his head from side to side. I took her out one day, a long time ago. The entire time, I acted like, he dropped his gaze again, his mouth was left squirming, and said, I acted like Sasuke. I wanted to impress her because I knew she was still infatuated with him. Taking one last moment of silence before he said, what a stupid idea that was, because even though I did her that day, I didn't feel anything. The rain pounded against the puddles of mud around them, followed by a crack of thunder. Ino widened her eyes, feeling herself tense at the idea of a thunderstorm. She always loved the rain, but never when she was an open target outside any form of shelter. I'm sorry, she blurted out, staring down at the cluster of wet grass. She began to pluck at it, something to keep from focusing on this awkward moment. Why is that? I just felt it was my time to say sorry. A weak smile brightened her face. Well then, he exhaled deeply, forgetting to smear away the rain that had dripped onto his hair. I'm sorry too. Ino shook her head, finding herself chuckle at how amazingly ridiculous they both appeared at the moment. Wordlessly she allowed Naruto to gently take a hold of her hand, linking his slender fingers with her small fist. You want to know the truth? He watched her nod in silence. The truth is, Naruto lifted his chin, and for the first time in a very long time, there was no humor in his eyes. I don't love Sakura. The truth is it'll never happen. He sighed, heavy-heartedly, taking a passing glance at her side before turning back. I'm sorry I put you through so much crap. He chuckled lightly, peering down at his drenched clothes. I'm sorry we're wet and hungry and have no idea where we're at. She pressed her forehead against his, lowering her gaze towards their now linked hands. Interestingly enough, the rain gradually dwindled into soft drizzles faster than she had expected. She stared into the dark center of his pupil, a bit surprised how earnest he has sounded. Perhaps, for the first time, there was no mask of arrogance in his demeanor, just a smile, one appealing smile that had Ino smiling back. His breathing tickled her nose as she stood only centimeters away from his face. There was a long pause afterwards, when she found herself staring. She felt herself needing something to say, but she didn't know whether it was appropriate timing. When she saw how attentive Naruto seemed, she couldn't help but blurt out, "I'm a train wreck, Naruto." "That's okay," he nodded, followed by an amused grin. "No, I mean I'll drive you crazy, you wouldn't be able to take it." "No," Naruto chuckled, a slight scowl forming on his L. "I already have." Answer, he seized the moment. He quickly yanked onto her arm, bringing her close as he forcefully pressed his L onto her. He cupped her chin, ignoring the pitter-patters of rain that only S onto the top of head. At the end of this sloppy K he pulled back, only to gaze at the softly flushed Ino. "I did that because you're Ino and that is the only reason why." She leaned in for a brief K. When pulling back, Naruto wiped at the raindrop trailing from under her eye. "Thank you," she whispered gently, her words heard faintly against the sounds of rain. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.